Well, to discuss the issue of state care, I was joined just a short time ago in this studio by the New South Wales Minister for Family and Community Services, Prue Goward. Prue Goward, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Margot O'Neill ended that story by saying we may be creating a lost generation. Is that what we're dealing with here?
Well, it wouldn't be the first lost generation. I think where perhaps the story is perhaps a little oversimplified is to blame foster carers for the conversion of a lost generation of foster children, for the turning of them into a criminal group. Clearly, foster care lets down a lot of children, and a lot of children end up as adults homeless, much more likely to go into the juvenile justice system, much more likely to have babies before they should. But there are many reasons for that, and I think foster carers do such an amazing job with increasingly complicated young people that it's a little unfair to suggest that that's what's driving it.
Let's start with the figures. The figures are widely known. 18,000 children in care in New South Wales. That's a population of a very large town.
That's right. It's the highest rate in Australia, and we came in to get that rate down.
Why is it happening, though?
Well, it's happened, I think, for a lot of historical reasons. But the fact is that it's more than 1 in 100 children in New South Wales are removed, and as we've just seen, the outcomes are shocking for a lot of them.
Yeah, judging by what's going on in Queensland, and there seems to be evidence this is also happening in New South Wales, the people who studied it are telling us the state and its non-government partners are literally creating criminals, criminalising children. Do you accept that's what is happening? Parents
are the beginning of this problem. We do not remove children until they are at risk of significant harm, until they've been bashed, neglected, not loved, not looked at, not fed, exposed to shocking violence, sexually abused. That's what causes us to remove children. And that leaves, inevitably, some long-term damage, and it's not surprising that these kids in adolescence have to really struggle to lead normal lives. So I think that's the first thing we have to remember. Governments do what they can. We know more and more about how to lift young people and get them back onto a normal track. We know that if we intervene early with families, we can keep that family together. And that's really, obviously, a great place to end up. That's what the Victorians do more. That's where we're trying to go. But you can't do that if you're leaving children at risk of harm.
If you're trying to do that, do you accept Kath McFarlane, the PhD student, do you accept her analysis that you're much more likely to end up committing a serious crime if you're living in care?
You're much more likely to have children who don't have any trusting relationships with adults, because we found when we got in that a huge proportion of teenagers in out-of-home care had had at least 3 placements. You can't form relationships.
So there's a churn of carers.
Oh, because there's a reason for that relationship breaking down. The former government hadn't invested in out-of-home care, so the children were never seen by caseworkers, so they could go on in terrible circumstances until the kid couldn't cope anymore and the placement broke down. So I think Kath's assertion that it ends up in criminality, I mean, that's generations old, that link. What we have to understand is why. And I think the first thing is they are terribly abused and neglected. That's why they've been put into care, and that inevitably has consequences for their behaviour as adults and young people.
I'll come to potential solutions in a moment. Let me just go past this. We've been speaking to service providers in this area. One prominent one told us that police are being called in an average of 18 times a month. That's every 2 days, effectively. Why are the police being forced to pick up the pieces in situations like this?
Look, I think I know plenty of foster carers who would never call a police officer to their home and who would deal with a very violent and unhappy child, because often by the time that last foster carer gets the child at 13 or 14, they are deeply troubled and their behaviour is absolutely out of line. But I suspect there are foster carers for whom that is too much. If it was your own child, and you felt that you were their parent and they were yours forever, you would take them on yourself. You would say, you don't go knocking holes in the house. But when it's a foster child and you don't know if that child's going to stay with you for 6 months or 6 years, perhaps you do more likely call the police. And of course that gets that child instantly then involved with the criminal justice system.
It does indeed. And
so I can understand why that would occur in some foster homes.
Should there be new protocols as to when police should be involved in this?
I think we do have to look at that, and certainly that's one of our reforms. But I think we also have to understand that as the level of drug abuse in young women as well as young men increases, and we have an increasing number of children born with behavioural and intellectual difficulties, that the sort of children that we're having in foster care are more complex. Every foster carer I know says the children are different. They're different to what they were 20 years ago, and they are more challenging for foster carers, good, loving foster carers, to do something with. And I think what's interesting is that children in kinship care relationships with grandma and grandpa or an auntie or a sister-in-law, they are much less likely to enter the criminal justice system than those in ordinary foster care. And that tells you something about the power of love and the power of relationships.
Perhaps it tells us that the idea the Victorians seem to have adopted of restoring more and more children to their original families is the way to go. Is that what you're going to do here?
Oh yes, that's absolutely one of our objectives, that we want to reduce the rate of removal. Now, you can't not remove a child if they're at risk of harm. What you can do better at, and what the Victorians have done a lot better at, is getting the child back home. That means you've got to work with the family, with the home, with the child absent, of course. And remember what these homes are. There are very high levels of drug and alcohol addiction. There are very high levels of domestic violence. 40% of all cases have domestic violence involved, and very high levels of psychiatric illness. So we are asking for enormous resources to get these families straight before we can return these children, and we need to do that.
Have you heard, because we have anecdotally, that it's much harder to deal with children, to place children, to get children into proper care as they get older?
Oh,
so
absolutely.
from the age of 6, very bad, but what about when they're in their teens?
Look, it's almost impossible to get an 8-year-old boy placed. Nobody wants an active, distressed 8-year-old boy. By the time they get to the teen years, and if it's their first removal and they've run away from home because mum's got a new boyfriend and he's taking it out on this teenage boy, or it's a teenage girl and the stepfather is making advances, so she leaves, it's very difficult to get families that will take them on, and that's where kinship care can be so helpful. But there's no doubt we have to do better with adolescents. I decided that in opposition. We've got adolescent specialist teams now in every one of our regions. They start on the 1st of July. We've got a special early intervention program for families with at-risk teenagers. First time we've actually focused on teenagers. So we can focus our resources more, because if we don't, I think what this electorate has to appreciate is that these people are on the cusp of parenthood themselves, these young people. We have a lot of girls already who have children as teenagers in foster care. So they are babies in foster care who have their own babies. These children, boys and girls, are much more likely to go on to have children they can't care for if we don't break this cycle now.
We are out of time, effectively.
Yes.
This is a national crisis by the sound of it.
I think it is, because the birth rates in this demographic is very high, much higher than the national average, and because of the freedoms that we believe in, it's much harder to work with families and to impose conditions on them. So you're always requiring the goodwill of families. And, you know, when you've got a huge percentage of kids born with brain damage, and when you've got parents with very severe addictions, getting that buy-in, getting that commitment, getting them to look at their children, to hold them and kiss them, is a huge challenge.
Prue Goward, we'll have to leave you there. Much more to talk about, but
Yes.
That's all we can do tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony.